Capitol Square in Richmond, Virginia, tells a story through monuments. Statues of slaveholders and segregationists have long marked this landscape. A more recent arrival writes a new chapter of the story. Figures of young people, African-American teenagers, reach for the moon. They show us how far we've come. They remind us how far we have to go. Prince Edward County, Virginia, sits some 65 miles southwest of the state capital. In the 1950s, schools were segregated here, just as the Supreme Court said they could be. The court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, a case decided in 1896, concluded that separate facilities for black people and white people were legitimate if they were of equal quality. In the decades that followed, from train cars to schools, legal segregation spread across the South. Equality did not follow. Black students here attended Moton High School in Farmville, the county seat. The building was designed for 180 students, but more than 400 attended. Overcrowded students learned in tar paper shacks and on school buses. Potbelly stoves provided what little warmth they could. Books were secondhand, and teachers were underpaid. Barbara Rose Johns was a 16-year-old junior at Moton High School. By the winter of 1951, she had had enough, and she decided to do something about it. Joy Cabrera Speaks was a freshman at Moton then, and best friends with Barbara's sister, Joan. I met Joy in the place where Barbara's plan unfolded, the school auditorium.
We got a note to come to the auditorium. What had happened, Barbara had planned everything, and she had this one student, John Watson, go down to the station and call the principal, Boyd Jones, and let him know that students were there misbehaving. Boyd Jones was a very disciplinarian. And once you said that students were not behaving, he was going to be out. And Barbara went to work making notes for the teachers. And she signed BJ, which is the same initials as the principal, BJ. So all of the teachers thought that Boyd Jones was summoning us to the auditorium. And the curtains opened. There was Barbara John standing behind the podium.
A different BJ.
Yes, a different BJ. Barbara asked the teachers to leave because she said that she did not want them to get in any trouble. So Barbara had a couple of the football players to escort them out.
Wow.
And she took her shoe and hit the podium to make sure that everybody was paying attention. And she started to make her speech about we didn't have to settle for what we were settling for, crumbs, and that we should follow her and go on strike.
Would people have expected Barbara to have done such a thing?
She was nice and kind, but we didn't know that she had this going through her mind.
Wow.
And her sister was about 3 rows in front of me. Joan kept sliding down in the chair. She was afraid of what her sister was going to say. She didn't know what she was going to say next.
One student later recalled Barbara's words. "Our parents ask us to follow them," she said, "but in some instances, a little child shall lead them." Nearly all of the students joined Barbara on strike. The next day, a group marched down to the county courthouse to lodge their complaints. No one knew what consequences they might face.
I was worried because I was afraid of what my grandparents were going to say to me. My grandmother was not happy at all because she was a prior teacher. So she felt that that was disrespecting because we should not have rebelled against the teachers. And my grandfather, he was all for it because he said that the parents had been trying and going to PTA meetings and everything and nothing happened.
So this had been building for a long time, obviously.
Yes.
Did anything happen close to the time that kind of triggered that strike at that time?
There was a bus accident on Elam Crossing in Prospect. 5 students were killed, and one of them were Barbara's best friend, Hattie Dungy. So with that, the bus was a secondhand bus because everything we had was secondhand, and she decided this was it.
Moton students remained on strike for 2 weeks, hoping to convince county officials to build a new school. As they plotted their next steps, they organized meetings at First Baptist Church on Main Street. Reverend Samuel Williams grew up attending First Baptist and later became a minister there. I met Reverend Williams to learn how he, Barbara, and fellow students navigated their uncharted path.
You know, it was a boom, a bomb dropped in Prince Edward, suddenly, and it had mixed reactions among people because people had never heard of that, boycotting, demonstrating, protesting for that which is right.
Did she turn to you as an ally?
See, I used to run my mouth a lot, and great talk, I run my mouth. But my greatest form of activity came out during the strike, organizing people in the community. You don't need to go back, meeting on street corners. You don't need to go back to Moton. Go back up there, nobody will be there but you or 2 or 3 because we are striking. We are striking for that which we know which is right.
Did it make you nervous as a young man to be playing a leading role?
I didn't just jump out doing it. I had some influences here in First Baptist. And the greatest of a leader that we had pastored this church, Reverend Griffin. Griffin stepped outside of the traditional circle of conventional preaching.
Reverend L. Francis Griffin offered to host a meeting with the students and 3 representatives from the NAACP. Lester Banks, director of the Virginia chapter, and attorneys Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson. This wasn't an easy meeting to get. At first, the NAACP actually discouraged the students, telling them that Prince Edward County was too dangerous a place for young black people to challenge segregation. But Barbara insisted, Reverend Griffin opened the doors, and the lawyers made the trip.
I can see coming right in that door, coming down the aisle, Reverend Griffin leading the way. Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, on their way in the pulpit.
Did you have to talk them into helping you?
Barbara sent a letter to them requesting them to come. And when the attorneys came, they informed us, but we won't take the case as an individual case in and of itself. We'll take several cases.
When Barbara and student body president Carrie Stokes wrote to Hill and Robinson, they asked for help in securing a better school for black students, one as good as the county's white high school. But by that point, the NAACP had changed tactics. The only way to ensure equal education, they observed, was if white and black students shared the same schools. Hill and Robinson told those gathered at First Baptist that they would take their case, but only if the students and their parents would fight for integration. The fight might take years. If they won, they would never enjoy the benefits, but they might just change the nation forever. How do you wrap your mind around the role you played in American history?
See, you don't think about that when you're doing it.
Right.
See, Barbara, she taught us how to combine vision with courage. There were people who would come and speak out against the movement, 1 or 2, but we booed them down right here. And it was a great fire that was kindled. Signs went up, words went out through church. Mass rally, Friday night, First Baptist Church, 7 o'clock. Come one, come all.
175 students and their parents signed on to be plaintiffs. When their case was folded into Brown v. Board of Education, 3/4 of all the plaintiffs were from Prince Edward County. 3 years after the strike, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. But here, the fight had just begun. Across the street from First Baptist is Beulah AME Church, another site of organizing and resistance. There, I met Amy Tillerson Brown. She grew up in Prince Edward County, and she's now a history professor and writing a book on Black women activists here. Amy explained how a moment of hope was quickly dashed.
In Virginia, you get a group of people who say, no, Brown v. Board was the wrong decision. And they take it so far as to say it was unconstitutional. It violated their states' rights. And so you get groups of segregationists who did not think that it was a good thing for their white children to attend school with Black children. And we go on and entering into this phase of massive resistance.
So how long is there between Brown v. Board and when this massive resistance began?
I say it started immediately, right after Brown. The Board of Supervisors here in Prince Edward County said before we comply with the mandate of Brown, we'll just shut all the public schools. So they founded the Prince Edward Academy for whites only and tried to encourage Black community members to start their own segregated schools. But after everything that had happened here with Barbara Johns and her protests, NAACP had implored leaders here not to accept segregated schools for Blacks. They had no idea of knowing that the schools would be closed for 5 years, not in '59, no crystal balls, nothing like that.
When the schools closed, Black families used a number of different strategies to help their children continue their education. Parents made difficult choices. Children moved to live with relatives in neighboring counties or states. Others lived with Quaker families up north. Among those who stayed in the county, some students had to abandon education altogether and instead went to work, helping their parents in the tobacco fields. Others went to grassroots schools set up by community members.
Black women especially basically said, you can take our public schools, but you can't stop us from teaching. So there was one woman named Flossie White Hudson. She was a beautician by trade. She said, I've got to teach these kids. So starting in '59, she'd have in her personal basement, sometimes as many as 50 children.
Wow.
And she taught them.
Was she alone?
No, she was not. You had schools in the basements of churches, in the back rooms of grocery stores, in people's homes, in nearly every magisterial district here in this county.
And do you have a sense that that young people who went through this system felt they got a good education?
Well, you know, the people that I have interviewed about attending these schools, they do say that they learned in these schools. And I remember when I first started interviewing, I thought, I understand why people said they're the lost generation, because kids without public schools, this was a huge deal. But the people that I knew personally were in no ways lost. My mom and my aunts and my uncle being a few of them. But the characterization that these folk just kind of sat around waiting for schools to reopen couldn't have been farther from the truth.
As Black families navigated life without public education, most white families sent their kids to Prince Edward Academy. The academy was founded by a group of segregationists, calling themselves the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberties. The Defenders helped spur the passage of legislation creating tuition grants for students to attend private schools in areas where public schools were closed. But Black students had no private schools to attend, so only white students could take advantage of the state funds. Localities across the South took note, using Prince Edward Academy as a model to start their own segregation academies. Kristen Green is a journalist who grew up in Prince Edward County and attended the academy. She writes about her family's role in this history in her book, Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County. I met Kristen at the academy, now known as Fuqua School.
I knew there was something
Right.
strange that had happened here. It was never explained to us as a student here at school, and I know students at the public schools told me the same thing, that they never learned the history either. And part of what it meant was that, you know, our whiteness was really centered, that white children who attended school here with me, we were the center of the universe, and being white was normalized.
So it's a hard history, and, in some ways your connection to it didn't really make it easier, right?
No, you're right. It was a double-edged sword in that way. I had started doing research for the book by interviewing family members, and my mom remembered a little bit about her father's role in being a founder of this school. So she was able to start me down my path of learning about it.
But for the research of your book, you talked to a lot of people who experienced that same history in a profoundly different way.
Yeah.
Well, what did you learn from them?
Some of the stories were just pushed under the rug, and so people weren't aware of the lengths that county leaders went to deny Black children an education. Elsie Lancaster was a woman who worked for my grandparents as a housekeeper a couple times a week. One of the biggest heartbreaks of her life was deciding to send her daughter to Massachusetts to attend school. She continued working for my grandparents during that period, and I think my grandparents did not acknowledge the loss, and that was really painful for her too.
American education is still segregated, right? And so this is kind of the problem that the city, the nation still faces. Tell me how it is that this academy evolved and how's it adapted to that new environment?
It's a different place than it was at the time that my parents attended school here, and certainly a different place than when I attended school here. I mean, it does have a more diverse student population. It does have a more diverse teaching staff. It is not a segregation academy. But the fact that it's still open means that this very small, poor community has 2 schools. And I think that has been a real challenge for the community that doesn't have a lot of resources in the first place.
What would you hope for Prince Edward County?
Part of that moving forward, of becoming a place with a new identity, is acknowledging that history that needs to happen by a lot of people, of the pain that was caused, before we can just move on.
4 years after the schools closed, the fight for equality continued, and it evolved. To compel county leaders to act and to draw media attention, Reverend Griffin and student organizers launched boycotts of downtown businesses. These protests were documented in photographs, and those photographs were digitized at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. I met Alice Campbell, a librarian at VCU. She made the photos available online and then took a scrapbook to Prince Edward County. She worked to put names with faces so the rest of us could learn about the people behind the protest. The project takes its name from the strikers' demand: freedom now.
These photographs were taken by someone hired by the police department so that they could be used as evidence if they were needed in court.
Where had those been kept before?
They were kept in the sheriff's department, and they were going to be thrown away. And they were rescued by a deputy who gave us permission to scan them. And the news that these photos were up spread like wildfire among the community.
With the help of community members, Alice has identified 90 people in the photographs. Their names help bring a richness to our understanding of these scenes, which often show tension and bravery.
These photographs are the protest outside the State Theater. This is Percy Milligan and Isaac Dungy and Catherine Scott. But if you look, you can see that he's got this button on. Do you recognize that badge? Let me see if I can get you a little closer. It's the March on Washington.
It is the March on Washington.
And this protest took place 4 days before the March on Washington, and they did go. They took a group. Boy, the things you see when you start really looking close. Through the glass, you can see school sale, and here again, back to school sale. The great irony is that for the protesters, there is no public school. No. This is a picture of Harold White. His mother was Flossie White Hudson, who was a teacher. The protesters are spaced very evenly because they didn't want to impede commerce.
So people could go to their cars and things, You wonder what's going through their minds.
I do. What happened to this little white boy who, what does he look like to you, 10?
Yeah.
Around 10, maybe? Facing these young people who are not that much older than he is. And what would he be thinking? What would his mother be thinking?
I was the same age as that little boy, and this is the South that I grew up in. So the cars, the clothes, it's very striking, a little bit weird to see these kind of shards of my own memory. And I remember one of the first things I learned was the C and the W, so I wouldn't drink out of the wrong water fountain when we went downtown. So, librarians have been the main people who figured out how to make these sources speak across a long time, to sustain them, to translate them. This strikes me as just a beautiful example of what modern scholarship can look like.
I feel so fortunate to have been able to do this work and to have been trusted with it.
The students' demonstrations drew media attention to Prince Edward County and drew federal intervention. The Kennedy administration could no longer ignore that children in the United States were deprived of education, especially while the country was fighting a Cold War under the guise of freedom and democracy. In 1963, the Kennedy administration helped open what they called free schools, and they recruited teachers to move to the county. In 1964, 5 years after the schools first closed, the Supreme Court, in a new decision, ruled against the school board. Prince Edward County was forced to reopen its public schools. Students once again filled the halls of this school, though many struggled to catch up on all they had missed. Kanan Townsend is the director of education at what is now Moton Museum. He explained the ongoing challenges that Black students faced as they returned to school.
So here's where it kind of gets interesting, because the courts had ordered Prince Edward County Board of Supervisors to appropriate the funds. The county only appropriated about half of what they had requested, so the schools do reopen, but they were severely underfunded. In 1969, students go on protest again due to the firing of one of their favorite teachers and due to the lack of school funding. In the 70s, really, you finally get to the point where we can be considered a normal county again, because you had that whole spectrum of students, many of which who had never went to school at all and started first grade at 11 years old, right? And so you finally age out that population, but we still have that legacy. These are stuff that other counties don't have to deal with.
This building served as a school until 1993. Some county leaders wanted to tear it down, but a group of Black women educators, the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women, launched a campaign to save the building.
They go to the County Board of Supervisors to purchase this building and with the idea of preserving it and turning it into a museum. Then they start to try to seek historic status for this building. There was kind of some pushback locally here on the state to not grant this site historic status. So in a very unorthodox route, they circumvent that by getting national historic status.
Kind of like the school struggle, right? You
Exactly.
have to go to the federal government.
to get, exactly. And so a lot of our work today is really contextualizing this history, but also using that as a way to stay relevant.
Today, Moton Museum, in affiliation with Longwood University, invites visitors to see this history up close. Visitors sit in the auditorium where Barbara Johns made her impassioned speech. They tour the former classrooms, now galleries that tell this complex story. Joy Speaks, Reverend Williams, and other alumni meet with students here and share their firsthand experiences. In this space, built for workshops and events, Kanan leads activities for school groups. He told me why this history matters to his generation and the next. So it's my understanding that you have a family connection to Moton?
Yes. I was actually volunteering here at Moton, and I look up and I see the plaque, and I see Townsend, Townsend, Townsend. And I was like, this community is not big enough to have that many Townsend and not be related to me. And two of my great aunts were students here at Moton High School, walked out with Barbara Johns, and then they became plaintiffs. Fast forward to my dad and his siblings. He was 6 when schools were closed in 1959. When he goes back, he's 11 years old in the first grade.
Wow. So what does it mean to you to have the opportunity to explain this place to visitors?
It's emotional. Certainly when the parts when I can point out one of my great aunts who I knew. I'm happy to be a conduit to the story. It's easy for students to think that this history was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We've only had desegregated schools in Virginia for 60.
How do students make this imaginative leap between their own lives and these great people of the past?
One activity we do with students when they come into the museum is that we challenge them to kind of plan their own strike. And when we're going through the exhibit, I say, look, you may think that the powers that be may not be willing to listen to you, but you all have the same capacity that they had to go out and impact positive change.
The African American students of Prince Edward County showed the nation in the 1950s and 60s what they still show us today. What's possible when people of courage and conscience act for justice. Barbara Johns took the stage in 1951, before Rosa Parks refused to get off a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, before Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So much of what we think of as the civil rights movement, protest in Birmingham and Selma, freedom rides, the March on Washington, took place after the student strike in Prince Edward County. Barbara told her classmates, sometimes a little child shall lead. Young people pointed the way to justice then, and they will again and again.